most solar PV systems here in Australia now have a smart meter that's transmitting, interval data related to their power and energy consumption. So we can actually look at that data and detect when systems aren't operating as they should. So more or less, we mine this huge amount of data that these utilities now have and work out where these problems are isolated to. So we put this basically into a reporting feature in the platform, and we can serve that up to our electrical utility clients. They can see within seconds exactly where these problems are.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of CleanTechies, the podcast. This is episode 36, and we are going to be talking today with Brendan Banfield, who is the CEO and co-founder of Gridsight. Gridsight is a company that is basically taking data that utilities are often already collecting and helping them to create better solutions on how to basically manage the utility and how the utility interacts with distributed energy resources that the grid has. So for those not familiar with those terminologies, that would be referring to residential solar, right? Solar on top of just average people's rooftops, right? It obviously produces a lot of energy, and it's not necessarily, it's kind of a bit sporadic. So this kind of data is able to help them increase the efficiency that they work together. So it's a really kind of fascinating type of area that they're looking in. I think really interesting solutions they're providing. So very interesting conversation. I think it was also kind of timely to release this roughly a year after the prolonged electricity outage in ERCOT back in February of 2021. So I thought it was maybe a nice timing there. But anyways, before we get into the show, I do want to make mention to our sponsors, Next Wave Partners. As always, this podcast is made possible and sponsored by them. So Next Wave are experts in the talent acquisition and recruitment space across climate tech, renewables, ESG, and ESG globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change, please consider reaching out to Next Wave. You can do that a few different ways. Mainly go to their website at next-wavepartners.com. You can also reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. You can find the best consultant suited to speak with you there. But again, big thanks to NextWave for making this possible. So without any further delay, let's get into the conversation. All right, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Silas. How are you?
I'm great. Well, I guess why don't we start with why don't you just give us a quick introduction to yourself and kind of what you're doing right now, and then we'll go into your backstory from there.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Brendan. So I'm the co-founder and CEO at Gridsight. So at Gridsight, we're basically a software company, and we're building the software infrastructure that allows electrical utilities to realize the decentralized and decarbonized grid of the future. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but Australia has some of the most, I guess, significant amounts of solar in the entire world. So around 1 in 4 houses here in Australia actually has a PV system, and that's basically the most per capita solar in the entire world. So, here in Australia, we have around 800 watts of installed solar per person. And that's like 8 times the world average. So comparing that to somewhere like the US, I think they have around 230 watts of installed solar per person. Even a place like California, where renewables are, ubiquitous, there's, even around 700 watts there. So we're kind of really leading the charge here in Australia in that sense. So from a sustainability standpoint, that's excellent. But what's actually happening is we're starting to see some issues with grid reliability in areas where there's huge amounts of solar PV. So at its crux, at its core, Gridsight's basically assisting these utilities by, identifying these problems that solar can be causing and trying to find solutions so we can get more solar on the grid. Yeah.
So could you, I guess, there's a couple of things there I'd be interested to unpack, but maybe first we'd be keen to understand, how did you kind of end up into this journey? What was your backstory, and how did you become interested in solving this problem in the first place?
Yeah, for sure. So my background is an electrical engineer. So I studied just a bachelor's of electrical engineering quite a few years ago. And during that time, I was kind of lucky enough to get an internship with an electrical utility called Evo Energy here in Australia. So that gave me some really good background around, how these utilities operate and I guess some of the challenges that they're facing. So every summer I'd work for this utility, and I was getting exposed to some of these problems even back then. So this was around, 2013, 2014, with some of these problems that solar was beginning to cause on the grid. So from that, I actually started to do my undergraduate thesis on this problem, looking at how we can manage solar in a better way to I guess, get more solar on the grid and improve this reliability. So that went really well. And from there, I finished my bachelor's degree and really wanted to, I guess, transition to the renewable space. That's really where my interest was kind of falling. And I got in contact with a member from the university who said that our university was participating in what's known as the Solar Decathlon again. So this was the second time my university was doing it, where essentially we build a smart solar powered house here in Australia, and then we take it to another country to compete against other universities from all around the world. So in my instance, we were taking the house to Dubai, and I saw this as, I guess, the perfect opportunity to put some of my, knowledge I'd learned through my bachelor's into practice, and actually being to, undertake a PhD related to renewables and work on a physical house where I kind of got to get my hands dirty. So that was, I guess, the perfect opportunity for me to really dive deeper into the technical sides of, solar PV and batteries and distributed energy resources in residential buildings. So yeah, I was a team leader on that project. We built the house here in Australia. It was called the Desert Rose House. And we took it all the way over to Dubai and rebuilt it there in 2 weeks, and then competed against 15 other teams from all around the world. So that was, an excellent experience. We actually managed to get second place in that competition, which was really, really good. A lot of hard work went into that. And then the house got brought back to Australia and rebuilt here. So after the Solar Decathlon, I kind of was just finishing off my PhD. I was running a lot of experiments on the house, doing a lot of testing around exactly what we were discussing, how to control solar batteries, air conditioning systems to not only benefit the people living in the home, but the grid as well. And during that time, I was doing a lot of analytics with, grid data. I was doing a lot of experiments within a microgrid at my university. And I was kind of coming to the realization that there's, a lot better ways you can actually model the grid and model these systems on the grid using just, raw voltage and power data you can get from, regular meters, as opposed to these kind of more old school, I guess, mathematical methodologies that they often use. So I had this kind of idea that, there's definitely something here. And I know that there's a lot more metering going on these networks that isn't really being used to its fullest potential. So I got in contact with my best friend and now co-founder, Kurt, who's done a couple of startups before, and was basically explaining what I was doing with my PhD. And he was like, I think there's a business here. Like, let's do it. And that was more or less how Gridsight was born.
Interesting. So I guess there's a lot of things I'm keen to understand. I think Australia presents a good example to learn from. You mentioned that
Sure.
You have the highest amount of solar per capita there. Do you have any insight as to how that came to be? How did that much adoption become kind of widely spread?
Yeah, great question. So it really started around, I believe it was in 2010 or 2011. So the government brought in these really large incentives to put solar PV on your house. So at that time, people were paying around 20 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity they get from the grid. But the government was bringing in incentives that would pay you 60 cents, so triple, for putting electricity back on the grid from a solar PV system. So this led to just widespread adoption, throughout the whole country, because people were thinking, I can get 3 times as much money than I'm paying for this energy. Like, what an excellent deal. So that really drove the initial, I guess, spike in installations. And from there, it kind of just, I think a combination of, so just for a bit of context, those incentives ended up stopping just because I don't think the government could afford it anymore.
Yeah.
But the cost of solar PV systems continued to drop. So, the price of a PV system now, you can get a really solid size system around maybe 8 kilowatts on your roof for a few $1,000s Australian. So I think a combination of that initial jump and now the continually falling prices of solar has just made it such a, such a viable investment. Plus we have, here in Australia, there's so much solar resource, lots of sun down here. So it makes a lot of sense to put people to put PV systems on their houses.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I think that'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I think you mentioned California, right? They have a lot of incentives. There's a big battle right now to keep their incentives. I think there might be a bill in the balance at the moment, but I don't know. It might already be resolved by the time this comes out. We'll see. But I guess I'm curious, maybe for more background to understand, since you have the experience on the utility side, or at least an understanding of it. How did the grid work prior to all of this distributed energy resources? And then we'll get to what that actually means. Could you kind of explain like the history of it, the metering. I'm curious to understand the technologies and then maybe how it's gone through evolutions and what you kind of see coming. Eventually, we'll get to that.
Yeah, excellent question. So traditionally, the grid was just built for more or less the one-way flow of power. So essentially, at the very start of the network, you'd have a large generator, whether that's like a coal-fired power station, whatever it may be, which produces the energy, which gets transmitted over, large transmission lines that everyone sees kind of along highways and that sort of thing. That would go into a substation, which would distribute it, throughout the residential and kind of commercial areas. And then it would finally end up in someone's house where that power is being used. So that was just always the one-way flow of power. And traditionally, I'm not sure if it's the exact same in the US, but particularly here in Australia, the utilities here would really only care about what was happening up to what's called the medium voltage network. So things up to around 11,000 volts, and everything further downstream from that, which is where everyone's houses are connected, they more or less weren't too worried because everything there just worked. It wasn't too complex, and more or less, it was safe to just assume that everything's going to be fine that side of the network. Which is kind of a twofold problem because, basically it meant that there wasn't a whole lot of data recorded for those parts of the network over the years because they just didn't really care. And now that we're seeing large amounts of distributed generation in these parts of the network, we're actually seeing, bi-directional flow of power. So we're seeing, not only people consuming power, but people are also, putting power back onto the grid. So this part of the network that traditionally was, I guess, the simplest to manage has actually now become, the most difficult to manage. And moreover on that, because they don't have as much data for these parts of the network, it's very difficult to actually model, what's happening here and for these utilities to gain visibility on what these problems might be. So that's where the real challenge is starting to lie. And I guess getting onto your point around metering, we're starting to see a lot of smart meters being put in this part of the network. So traditionally, if people wanted to know, or if people were getting their electricity bill, someone would come out to their house, look at their meter every 3 months, and that's more or less all that would happen. But now that we're getting these smart meters, which can, record voltage and power consumption at, 15, 10, 5-minute intervals, this presents a huge opportunity to start, I guess, using this data to manage these issues that are happening in the networks that are connecting people's houses compared to what was, traditionally just forgotten about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think there's a lot of things. It's hard. This is a complicated topic. Maybe the next thing I think would be helpful to understand is what are some of the negative effects of too much energy coming from these, residential solar properties?
Yeah. So I guess the biggest problem that's happening is majority of these systems that are getting installed, as you said, are residential. So they're going on people's houses, and I guess pre-COVID, not many people are actually home to use that energy when it's being produced, I guess, during the middle of the day. So what that's is causing to happen is most of this energy is getting exported back into the network, which is causing what's called voltage rise. So if lots of power is getting pushed back into the network and it's not being used, it causes the voltage to go up. And when that voltage goes up too high, it can basically cause the grid to become unstable. And here in Australia, we have standards that actually specify when the voltage becomes too high, people's solar PV systems actually need to disconnect from the grid. So if they see that their solar PV system has risen above, or their grid connection has risen above 253 volts for a certain amount of time, that PV system is going to disconnect. Now, this is a really big issue for a couple of reasons. One is that, more or less, most of these systems are purchased, by individuals, by mums and dads and that sort of thing. So when there's large amounts of solar, they really want to get, the best bang for their buck and use the most renewable energy in their home. But if there's so much solar around and it's disconnecting from the grid, they're not getting, I guess as much, value out of their investment. And twofolds, when we've got all these PV systems disconnecting, it can actually lead to a fairly significant loss amount of renewable energy going onto the grid, which ends up just being subsidized by coal. So that's the core issue that we're seeing here in Australia. So we're basically seeing lots of export during the middle of the day, no one there to use it, which causes reliability problems. And in turn, that's causing, PV systems to disconnect from the grid.
Okay, so then what, maybe let's talk about the solutions then, right? With what Gridsight is doing and how you're identifying this. And could you just talk about, feel free to talk about all the different types of solutions and how you guys are identifying them. I think that'd be really interesting to go into now.
Yeah, excellent. So I guess a bit of context to the way that the utilities are currently managing this problem, particularly with the solar systems not operating correctly, is it's purely a reactionary effect. So more or less, all they're doing is waiting for customers to realize that their PV systems aren't actually operating as they should. They'll call up the utility and they'll make a complaint. The utility will send a truck out there to basically put a little measuring device on the pole. They'll come back a week or two later, grab it off the pole, and an engineer will kind of analyze the data and they'll see if there's any issues there. And then if there is an issue, they might do a bit of engineering work to work out whether they might need to reduce the transformer voltage or, do some other, network solutions. So it's a very kind of tedious and arduous process that they currently have to, I guess, work out this or solve this issue that's happening. So what we're doing at Gridsight is we're taking the data from people's smart meters. So the real benefit here, particularly in Australia, is that most solar PV systems here in Australia now have a smart meter that's transmitting, interval data related to their power and energy consumption. So we can actually look at that data and detect when systems aren't operating as they should. So more or less, we mine this huge amount of data that these utilities now have and work out where these problems are isolated to. So we put this basically into a reporting feature in the platform, and we can serve that up to our electrical utility clients. They can see within seconds exactly where these problems are. So that's the first step, is just determining where the issues are and where the most severe issues are. And then twofold on that, we're also looking at the solutions around how we can mitigate these issues. So in our platform, we have the ability to determine optimal tap settings of transformers that might be their voltage is too high at the transformer. Or often we find that what can happen is a lot of these PV systems will get installed on the same phase. So here in Australia, we have 3 phases for the low voltage connections. If you have all the PV installed on the same phase, which can sometimes happen, it means the voltage is going really high on one phase, but not the others. So we can actually look at how we can spread that PV across evenly all 3 phases, which usually mitigates the issue. And then thirdly, there's a lot of, talk here in Australia about some more, dynamic and more advanced control strategies that can be used to help mitigate these problems. And one of the key ones is this idea of a dynamic operating envelope, which is basically where you're able to limit the amount of export by PV systems based on, the conditions of the grid, the weather conditions. So you can try and maximize how much renewable is going on the grid while trying to ensure that nothing cuts out. We're maintaining that amount of reliability. So Gridsight itself, we're not participating, or we're not doing any of that control just yet, but I think it's something, we'll definitely be, contributing to down the track. Yeah.
I guess this is fascinating. I think this is a super complicated topic, right? This entire transmission space is not easy to understand, especially for non-engineers. But I think I'm curious to understand what about the possibility of microgrids in general? Maybe you give people an idea of what a microgrid is first, but I'm curious, generally speaking, on the future of breaking up the larger grid into more robust or manageable microgrids that can autonomously manage each other. And if you just want to talk about that and give us kind of some insight there, would be great.
Yeah, for sure. So there's kind of lots of different definitions for microgrid, but the one I kind of lean on is, it's a kind of decentralized grid that can be disconnected from the main greater grid and still operate exactly as you said, reliably and under its own, functions and its own power and that sort of thing. So I think there is certainly a lot of validity there. So we have quite a lot of isolated microgrids here in Australia. So there's lots of, areas out in the desert where we have really small towns that, it just makes no sense to get large transmission lines out there. So they're these isolated microgrids. But yeah, they're seeing these problems of, managing these large amounts of decentralized renewables. So I really think for the microgrid idea, the core, functionality that's going to make them more feasible is this idea of coordinated control and this idea of being able to manage these several decentralized resources in a distributed way that can try and, ensure that the most amount of renewable energy technology is being used, while still maintaining reliability. And that's kind of the key issue that hasn't really seen, I think, massive takeoff from the the microgrid space is this idea of reliability. It's a very complex problem keeping a grid up and running, particularly a very small grid that has, what's called a small amount of inertia. So there's no real big generators, just keeping the system chugging along. So when you've got lots and lots of little inverter systems that are affected by solar and, wind turbines that are affected by wind, all these things, the intermittency of these technologies, that's where the real challenge lies. But I think there is a lot of opportunity there that I think should be leveraged a lot more.
I guess I'm kind of curious, are there initiatives or things you're aware of that could help? I mean, I'm trying to give an example that might be tangible. At least my iPhone tends to have, it starts to pattern recognize, right? When I'm like, what kind of day is it? Battery usage, but it also does like, it'll make suggested apps to open it, etc. Are there companies or anything doing something similar for the grid, kind of as if it's one system saying, hey, here are the patterns we're recognizing, maybe combining with weather for these small grids and helping them to prepare for these things so they can, if there's a big battery connected, that they can start to learn how to automatically discharge it. Are there companies doing that?
Yeah. So that is a very topical area. So my research was very much based around exactly that. So I was looking at how you can, predict the consumption of the power in the home and combine that with the weather to try and get the most reliability out of all these different systems you have in the house, like an air conditioning, solar, batteries, these sorts of things. So there's certainly companies here in Australia. So there's lots of, VPPs or virtual power plants that are getting started, which kind of look at aggregating large amounts of technologies. So here in Australia, there's one company called Switched In that's doing this large amount of aggregation where they can talk to different, technologies, whether it's a battery, solar, electric vehicle charger. What we have found, so particularly what we're doing here at Gridsight, a lot of the grid isn't quite yet up to speed with able to getting this level of kind of real-time data to be able to perform these functions. So the problem with this sort of advanced control is you need, large amounts of real-time data coming in. So you need to know exactly what's happening within the state of the network, which is certainly possible, but it just might require, large installations of additional metering and that sort of thing. But it's certainly something that I think is where the transition is heading. And this idea of kind of decentralized and, decarbonized grids will require exactly that sort of management of these assets. So we'd definitely like to get into that space down the track. And we've already started to look at some trials just purely kind of offline of how we can, so we've got a trial coming up looking at an isolated microgrid with a large amount of solar and how we can, manage this solar, look at what the weather's doing and look at what the load is on the microgrid to try and figure out the best way to reliably operate that microgrid. So it's definitely in the pipeline, and I think it's actually probably the key to this transition. It's just, I think a lot of these utilities first need to figure out where the problems are and tackle that low-hanging fruit. And then from there, we can start looking at those more advanced solutions in the pockets where there really are some severe issues.
Yeah, because I just want to make sure, maybe give a visualization here. It's almost as if, if you're looking at it like say it's a tree, right? And at the base of the tree is the generation plants, or at least the key generation plants, right? And as you go up, you have more and more branches that become smaller and smaller branches. Your work is looking at maybe some of the more mainstream branches and identifying, okay, this pocket here has this energy usage issues, and going as far as you can without going to the individual house, of course. And then eventually the reality is that we need to get meters on the very, very minuscule ends, right? Down to the very tiny data. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we do go all the way to the household. We even go we even do some disaggregation of the household load. So we can extract, where there's batteries, where there's PV system, where there's electric vehicles, and kind of pull that data out. But a lot of that, we start all the way right down basically within the people's house behind the meter assets. But then one of the real benefits we do is we kind of aggregate up from there. So utility typically won't go out, unless there's something really severe happening, they won't go out and fix a house on a person by person basis, more or less. They'll kind of see where a pocketed problem might be and try and get, as much, bang for their buck in one foul swoop. So we're kind of going all the way behind the meter, but then aggregating up and saying, here's this larger pockets that if you're able to kind of address these problems, you can solve, significant amount of issues related to, renewable energy integration for a large portion of your customer base.
And so what are some of the main, I guess, the main solutions that exist now, aside from maybe upgrading the grid and transitioning some of the wires? Like, are there any other solutions with batteries or anything like that that can be really very helpful to help solve these issues?
Yeah. So that's a very topical area here in Australia at the moment. So as you said, one of the big ones is kind of community batteries. So there's lots of kind of larger scale batteries going in the order of 250 kilowatt hours. So more or less 10 times or even more, 20 times what a traditional kind of household battery could store. So they're being put in communities where there's large amounts of solar. So instead of everyone having their own battery, we have this kind of community battery that can help absorb a lot of this excess solar that's going into the grid. So that's a really popular one that's starting to get a lot of traction, and there's a lot of trials here in Australia as well. Another big one is what I mentioned before, is this idea of dynamic operating envelopes, or being able to, say to a solar PV system, majority of the year, maybe it's fine for it to export 2 kilowatts, but 1 or 2 sunny days a year where the grid's a bit congested, they might wind that export down to 5 kilowatts, say. So that's getting a lot of traction and a lot of trials here in Australia as well. And I guess, a final one, which is also getting a lot of attention here in Australia, is this idea of basically, we call it here a solar sponge. So it's basically using some load on the network to soak up some of that excess generation from the PV systems. So what a lot of these electrical utilities are trying is using their controlled hot water load. So here in Australia, there's large amounts of residential hot water heaters that basically traditionally, they turn on between 10 at night and 1 in the morning when the electricity prices are nice and low. But what a lot of these utilities are looking at is, hey, maybe we can turn this on during the middle of the day and can actually, for free, soak up some of this excess generation from the solar PV. So that's starting to gain a lot of traction here. And the beauty of that technology as well is it already exists. Like, it's already out there in the network. It's just a matter of figuring out when the best times to shift this hot water unit heating load to be able to soak up that excess solar. So that's one I'm particularly interested in as well, just because, as I mentioned before, we really want to target this low-hanging fruit that can kind of be implemented today to really start solving this problem and ensure we can keep driving home this amount of solar PV that's on the grid.
I mean, this is fascinating. I think this idea, the entire idea of getting the data so that everybody can see it, and that you can, say for example, the utility just makes it public, right? Makes this data available. Somebody might come along and develop a software that says, hey, here's a way for a homeowner to hook up their smart home to the data that we have and say, okay, hey, it'll automatically communicate with those things to do things such as charging, heating up the water, or maybe charging their vehicles or whatnot. I just find this fascinating, this idea of partnership with the, traditionally, how many people really interact with their utility, right? Like on a regular basis, aside from paying their bill, right? I think this is fascinating. There's a lot of things I'd be keen to understand here. One big question I have is, what does the, in terms of like monetarily, how much money are you able to save utilities through this work? Like, what's the return on investment for them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So it's often a difficult one, because you often can't really putting a price on reliability of the grid is challenging. So you can look at things like, if the voltage is too high, it's going to be degrading assets and that sort of thing. Transformer life cycles aren't going to be as long. So we can save money in that way. But what's actually happening here in Australia, which is really interesting. So I guess our regulator here in Australia is called the Australian Electricity Regulator. They're actually bringing out a rule that basically is going to put a price on this idea of, it's called the customer export curtailment value. So what that means simply is the Australian regulator is going to put a cost on this amount of lost energy that's being, or the amount of renewable energy that's being lost as a result of too much solar. So what that is going to mean is that, and we're surfacing this in our platform. So we're mining the data and figuring out how much this energy is being lost. It means now that these utilities can put a dollar figure on the effect it's having on their customer base. So basically what they can say, just say, Gridsight finds that there's a significant amount of lost generation in this one suburb. The AER is going to give a dollar figure per megawatt hour for that value, and just say, in our platform, we surface those insights. Then that utility can go back to the regulator and say, hey, we've lost this much energy in this region. Based on that dollar figure, we want to invest in a community battery, or we want to invest in, a virtual power plant, or whatever it may be. So this, I think, figure is going to be a real game changer and allow these utilities to, I guess, put a lot of value on the renewable energy that's going into the grid, and also put, a lot of benefit back to the customers. Because at the end of the day, it's the customers at the edge of the network who are really losing out here. So for anything that can kind of give them benefits and ensure that, this continual rise of distributed generation is going onto the edge of the network, we think it's a great thing. So that's a real interesting one that's just coming up this year.
That's kind of that's pretty interesting. So it's not even as much about how much money you can save. It's about actually identifying how much money is being missed out, or how much value is not being created.
Exactly. It's basically looking at what impact are you having on your customer base by the network not operating correctly. How is that affecting all those customers who invested in this technology? And if it is affecting them a great deal, let's invest in some solutions that are going to mitigate that issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because obviously the incentive has to be to continue, this adoption. If that's the goal is to continue decarbonization of the grid. So, one thing I'm kind of fascinated by, I recently have been reading things about kind of this idea of uncertainty and black swan events, and obviously with climate change, continuing to kind of change weather patterns and everything. I'm curious if you could just maybe talk about some of the things worth looking at or considering as extreme weather conditions become more frequent. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the situation that happened this time last year in Texas, right? These type of situations where grid, I don't know if you say grid elasticity is needed, and rather than having things just kind of on the very edge of, hey, it works, it's fine, making it very robust so maybe the transmission lines can carry more energy than normal or than they need to. Like, could you just talk about this idea of having a robust grid that can handle different fluctuations, whether that's migration of folks from one part of the country to another, whether it's extreme weather patterns? I just want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a real interesting one. So Gridsight itself, we don't target as much the issues that are happening as a result of these, extreme weather events. Obviously, they're really severe. Like, we have pretty significant. So two years ago in Australia, we had some really severe bushfires that, were taking out large portions of the electricity network and that sort of thing. So it's certainly a problem that, here in Australia, similar to, California and Texas, that's being addressed. I think one of the big benefits here for that sort of reliability is things like big batteries. So we have one here in Australia. So I think one of the biggest in the world in South Australia from Tesla. So these big batteries can often come online in a second to provide that reliability. So I think it might have been a bit over 12 months ago, we had a large generator, so a large coal-fired power plant actually completely go offline here in Australia. And if that big battery wasn't there, so that big battery instantly came back online to supply that amount of lost power and get the frequency back up in the system. And if that wasn't there, I think we would have had hundreds of thousands of customers go black. So I think there needs to be a lot of thought putting into those kind of essential services that are required to, keep the grid operating if under these severe conditions. So whether that is, big batteries or, other generators, whatever they may be, to support the grid. And I think what we were talking about before, taking a bit of a data-driven approach to, trying to predict when these instances are going to happen. So if we're getting, a large weather front coming through or whatever it may be, or there's, severe, heat warnings or whatever it may be, I think there needs to be a lot of thought into how we kind of use data to predict when these instances are going to happen, and then try and plan for that as best we can with the infrastructure that's available.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think something I've noticed, especially with some of the things I've read recently, is that it seems as though with all of our prediction tools, we tend to think, oh, wait, we can measure these things going forward. We're just going to build maybe a little bit more than we need, rather than building something that's more robust and can handle it. And I'm just fascinated by this idea of kind of building, I don't know if you could give an example of like building a machine that's like a really tough tank rather than something that's very, it gets the job done, but it's not going to be lasting a long time. But of course, then there's the other issue, right? You have less flexibility. If you're building something stronger, typically you can't just change it out and move to another hardware. So I think this is fascinating. Are there any other points, kind of technically speaking, that you want to bring up about what you guys are doing here? Because I think I want to move on maybe to some more of like the educational background and pieces with the talent market.
Yeah, sure. So that's kind of at the crux of what we're doing. So our primary goal, as I said, is building this software infrastructure for the decentralized and decarbonized grid. So everything around that at the moment is focused on these, edge connected distributed energy resources. So one interesting thing that we're actually also doing, so we're not only working here in Australia, but we've got clients in New Zealand as well. And they've actually don't have as much solar PV, but they're starting to get huge amounts of electric vehicles on the grid. So we're actually starting to look at the problem from the other end of the spectrum as well. So, here in Australia, we have large amounts of solar, which are exporting huge amounts of power back into the grid. Conversely, what we're seeing with our New Zealand clients is they actually have large amounts of electric vehicle chargers that are pulling from the grid during those evening hours. So it's an interesting problem. It's almost like a similar problem, just other ends of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been really interested in looking at that and how we can kind of, as I said, disaggregate some of this electric vehicle charging load from people's houses and see what effect that's having on the grid, and how if potentially, these utilities could look at, mechanisms to shift some of this electric vehicle charging load, how it can improve the overall reliability of the network. So that's a really exciting one that we've got in the pipeline at the moment. Yeah.
Actually, this brings me to one thing we didn't really talk about is what is if a utility, say for example, some utility in the US wants to implement your software, what does the setup process look like? Is it pretty straightforward to do this? Is this data that's typically there? They just need to utilize it?
Yeah, so we use pretty much the most common data sources from utilities you can find. So our primary data that we ingest, like we're very data agnostic, more or less, we'll take anything we get. We can be really flexible in that sense. But the two primary data sources that we have in our platform are basically smart meter data. So data from people's houses, just the smart meter that typically records voltage and power. Even if it's just recording kind of energy intervals, we can still use it. And then the geographical information system data. So that's more or less just the network topology, the map of the network. And basically, a good 90% of our insights can be just derived purely off that data. So yeah, that's kind of where we realized there's such a huge opportunity, because these, electrical utilities for so long, they weren't equipped for being, a data analytics and I guess data science company, right? So they were just there to make sure that the lights stay on and keep the infrastructure standing up. And all of a sudden, they're hit with smart meters and they're getting terabytes upon terabytes of data that they just really don't know what to do with. So we're trying to basically unlock a lot of that value from these parts of the network, because we think this data has huge amounts of value that just needs to be, surfaced with the right insights.
Yeah, to me, this is fascinating. I've worked with some utilities, and it's interesting that they're essentially, kind of akin to governments, right? It's not a particularly quick moving place, but I've seen some utilities that are doing very interesting things, and it's interesting to see that they will start to do this, right? It has to become actually some of the most leading, like they have to be leading in terms of technology.
Yeah.
I think,
So here in Australia, for example, I was just going to say, here in Australia, for example, there's very similar thing. There's quite a broad range of the spectrum in terms of how advanced they are. So in Victoria, which is a state south of where we are in Sydney, they've had pretty much full smart meter coverage for close to 10 years now, like 100% of customers. So they're quite advanced in the analytics, and they've built up these kind of teams of, data analysts and data scientists and those sorts of things. But the rest of the country only has around 25% of smart meters across their networks. So they're still kind of just getting to grips with, how we're going to manage this amount of data, where we're going to store it, how can we, efficiently mine the data for certain insights. So yeah, it's super interesting space, and yeah, it's really fun to be a part of.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I'm excited to see how it goes. I think it's a challenge, obviously, right? Because you've got just an old school mentality of how to run them, but we'll see that change, I think. I had somebody on here in the past who worked for city government. He worked for Palo Alto, Dr. Jonathan Reichenthal, and he was talking about that when he first started, it was very difficult to bring talented people to come work for them because it was the government, right? I think that some of the same kind of principles need to be applied to the utilities, making sure it's appealing to those top talent who would normally go work at startups or something like that, right? So,
Of course.
I guess I'm kind of curious. Maybe it sounds like you've obviously it's a very different, kind of university system. It seems as though in Australia versus the U.S. here, but I'm keen to understand what your experience has been and what you think can be done better for with in terms of what universities are doing to help prepare people and people entering the workforce for these new climate tech jobs. Obviously there's so many new and fascinating things coming that are we really need people working on. So I'm kind of keen to hear your thoughts on how you might be partnering with them, what your experience was, and what you think could be done more of.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So yeah, I was lucky enough to have, throughout my PhD, have like a really good, I guess, exposure to, the industry as well, like the utility industry, as well as good exposure to, a topic where I was able to, as I said, work on the solar decathlon, which gave me a lot of exposure to the broader industry. I was talking with solar installers, like sponsors for batteries, sponsors for smart energy systems. So that gave me really good, I guess, exposure to the broader energy industry as a whole, which is really beneficial. But a lot of people don't, I guess, have that privilege. So I think there really needs to be a lot of, a lot more focus on particularly that idea, what you were saying of kind of the more business side of engineering, particularly when it comes to kind of clean tech and startups and that sort of thing. I think if there was more options for those, particularly for, undergraduate engineers to kind of see that world and how it operates, that'd be super beneficial for people kind of, who are minded like I am. So there is an accelerator here at the university I'm at, or University of Wollongong. So I was able to go through that accelerator and learn a lot about, I guess, the, other side of a startup and how it operates. So I think if that was, really made available to these, I guess, budding engineers who are coming through the ranks, I think that's, be hugely beneficial and kind of give people that appetite of what this whole clean tech space really looks like and why it's so exciting.
Yeah, that's actually quite fascinating. That's something I've noticed too with a lot of the recruitment activities is these engineers, super smart people, but oftentimes not really interested or at least aware of the kind of the business side of things. So that's actually that's interesting to see that you've agreed with that too. Let's see. I guess maybe finally, I'm kind of curious. I guess, how would you summarize to say that to really solve a lot of these grid problems, do you think that for the most part, this technology is already there? It's just about implementation?
For a lot of it, I would say definitely, yes. So a lot of it, there's already technology out there. There's already enough data in the network for us to start solving these low-hanging fruit problems and just pick up, or really mitigate some of these issues that we're seeing on the grid. And I think in the second instance, there's already so much technology out there, like all these inverters with solar that we can start leveraging if we can just communicate with them and these sorts of things. So I think for the most part, in probably 75, 80% of the cases, everything a lot of that can already be solved. And it's just kind of those edge cases, which are going to need those more advanced solutions. And that's what we're really trying to drive home here at Gridsight. You don't need to go from having no visibility on your network to implementing the most advanced, complex control system across 30 customers with solar. There's so much low-hanging fruit that you can, I guess, take across huge number of tens of thousands of customers. It's going to start solving some of these problems before you really need to dig into those advanced solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. You got to start small, right? If it's biting the whole pig at once, you're gonna have some issues there.
Exactly.
Are there any, given your technical insight, I think you might have some thoughts here. Are there any big areas where you think, in terms of the energy transition in general, that AI will play a huge role that it's not playing right now, or areas that are really budding that you're just kind of keeping an eye out?
Yeah, so like machine learning already plays a big role in our business. Like a lot of these insights we derive around, how these different distributed energy resources are operating on the grid is derived from these machine learning models that we create. So I think there's huge amounts of opportunity, particularly with the large amount of data that we're seeing. So one thing I think, particularly for we were discussing before about how we can kind of, operate these microgrids and manage these, smaller pockets and ensure these technologies are, I guess, working together towards a common, I guess, objective of a reliable grid. A lot of that, I think, is going to come down to using these machine learning models to, I guess, model these parts of the network. So traditionally, the way you kind of model an electricity network, if you want to control it or figure out how it's going to operate, is a very complex, mathematical, arduous task where you need to know exactly how long every line is, what its resistance is, et cetera, which just is not feasible in the current day and age. This data just doesn't exist in a lot of instances. So I think the modeling of these electricity networks and from the transmission all the way down to these customers is going to be data driven by machine learning and artificial intelligence and all these great technologies that we're starting to see.
Yeah, I think it seems as though that's the case. I think most of the solutions, or maybe not most, but a large majority of the solutions that have people who have come on this podcast, it has been derived from understanding the transparency or start understanding the data and having it be transparent. So I guess maybe to wrap things up, what would you say that you're looking forward to over the next, let's say 5 years or so in terms of how the grid operates? Maybe you can specify to Australia specifically, or just generally what you're anticipating and what are some of the things you're really excited for?
Yeah, great question. So I think finally starting to see, as I was mentioning before, this kind of decentralized yet coordinated grid start to come to fruition. So we're already seeing lots of trials here on, virtual power plants where, large amounts of disaggregated batteries are starting to work together to operate the grid. I'm really excited to see that continue to happen, where we kind of, move away from these large centralized generators and just start to see these more decentralized pockets of renewables that can, operate in unison and ensure the grid remains reliable and within the limits that are specified. So I think for me, that's the most exciting thing for me, and that's really what kind of drove me into doing a PhD as well, was looking at we have all these awesome technologies in these people's houses, whether it's batteries and solar and smart air conditioning systems, all these things. Let's start leveraging those to not only benefit the houses but also benefit the grid and the community as well. So watching that come into fruition, I think, is what I'm most excited about over the next 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, this is something interesting. This just came to my mind is this. I don't know if it's this way other places, but I know in America, a lot of my non-American friends have told me that this individualistic ideology that kind of just permeates everything in America, that is, I think, very true. But I'm curious if that will have an effect on making it harder to adopt some of these things. Because if you look at it, really, it's really accepting things as everybody's got to work together, right? If one person is like, hey, how can I just get benefit for me and for my house? It's not going to affect the whole grid, right? There needs to be cooperation and kind of transparency there both ways, right? From the utility, but also from the homeowners. So interesting stuff. But I guess thanks so much for coming on. If there's any other kind of closing thoughts you want to offer, glad to hear. Otherwise, I think I'm excited to see what you guys are going to do in the future.
Yeah, no worries. No, thanks for having me. It's been great to talk, and we're excited to see what happens, here in Australia in this space, and potentially, come over to the US soon enough and see how we can help out there as well.
Absolutely. I think we could use it. So looking forward to it. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. Really hope you enjoyed the conversation with Brendan. If you did enjoy it, please, and you want to continue hearing more of these episodes, do subscribe and turn on notifications to be made aware. We used to be releasing a lot more regularly on Thursdays, but the release schedule has been a little bit more sporadic. I've been pretty busy with work, but want to keep them coming at least weekly. So turn on the notifications to be made aware. Typically, there'll be one coming out every week. So you can just kind of peek back here when you get a chance. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, really do appreciate that you rate and review us. It really helps us to get greater reach, a lot more than you realize. And of course, we always ask, the whole point of this show is to help kind of spread the word about the climate technologies out there that are just better for the world, right? So please do share this with somebody who might find it interesting. Potentially, some people who work at a utility and could really stand to use kind of technology like this. So I think there's a lot of value in sharing it with our networks and kind of helping to actually increase the speed of change in the industry. So you can do that. If you want to get more involved, you can also join our Slack channel and chat with other professionals in the climate tech space. Of course, you can subscribe to the newsletter, which comes out every month on the 27th. And then, of course, it's probably worthwhile reaching out to Brendan and connecting with him on LinkedIn. Maybe look into the Gridsight website a little bit more to learn about their technologies if it fascinates you. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I'm always available there, or LinkedIn as well. But again, thank you so much for joining. Next week, we will be hearing in the next episode, we will be hearing from Tara Gupta at Map Collective. So look forward to that in the near future. But thank you again so much for joining us on this episode of CleanTechies, the podcast.